Now, Sega had its early beginnings in the hardware business, selling many different kinds of systems over the course of multiple generations. From the SG-1000 all the way up to Sega's most recent system, the Dreamcast, they had a truly interesting run until they simply could not sustain it. As everyone knows, Sega made a huge transition into becoming a publisher by selling software only, leaving the hardware business behind entirely. Why did Sega stop making consoles? How was their transition from hardware to software handled? And how are they holding up today? We'll be answering all of these questions in this mini documentary. Welcome to the death and rebirth of Sega in the gaming space. Now, prior to the third generation console race in the 80s, Sega was actually known for importing coin-operated arcade machines to Japan, as well as manufacturing slot machines and jukeboxes. In 1966, Sega began developing its own games, with Periscope being their very first one. This was not a video game per se, but rather a full-on machine with mechanical components. This was the trajectory that Sega would follow for many years to come, after several acquisitions. Eventually, Sega got into the video games business, which led them to the development and creation of their very first home console, the Sega SG-1000, which was released in 1983. This was Sega's first 8-bit console, which ended up receiving multiple hardware revisions. The system was pretty neat, but Sega eventually launched the SG-1000 Mark II, which had detachable controllers, and finished off with the Mark III series, which had upgraded GPU, meant to compete with the family computer's hardware. However, even though the Sega Mark III was certainly more capable than the Famicom, particularly when it came to things like color reproduction and the way that developers made games look more detailed on the Mark III than they did on Nintendo's system, they still had a tough time just trying to get a lot of publishers on board. This is mostly due to Nintendo's own anti-competitive practices, preventing most publishers from putting their games on Sega's consoles due to already agreed upon publishing contracts. The Sega Mark III did still get a decent chunk of games, but it just wasn't reaching enough people. In most parts of the world, Nintendo launched the NES in order to reach foreign markets, an endeavor that was incredibly successful and one that had a lasting impact in places like the US, where the gaming industry was crashing very hard. Sega did something quite similar, launching themselves into foreign markets in an attempt to compete with the titan that Nintendo had become in Japan and essentially the rest of the world. And that's when they gave us a system that looks like an 80s gamer's dream. In the States, we recognize the Sega Master System as their third generation offering, which we got in 1986. The system was essentially just a rebranded Mark III with many design cues that explicitly sell it as a top-of-the-line gaming system. It contrasts greatly with the NES, which took a completely different approach design-wise, but it is even more contrasted by the Mark III in Japan. The black and red design with the rather comfortable controller also made it stand out a bit more, but the similar publishing troubles were still affecting Sega and how the Master System sold. That didn't stop it from becoming very popular in certain regions such as Australia and Brazil, but for the most part, Nintendo was dominating the home console market nearly worldwide. A true shame considering that the Master System was a more powerful one between the two, and one that genuinely offered a better gaming experience in some respects than the NES did due to it simply being technically more powerful. Now, this allowed developers to dial up the level of detail on their games when compared to the NES, and many comparisons exist online to quantify how the Master System was just more capable. But alas, the third generation console race came to an end and the fourth generation was born. Sega got ahead of Nintendo, launching their most popular console ever, the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive as it was known in most other parts of the world outside of North America. This was a 16-bit system that showed off a ton of potential after the NES's dominance, even if it wasn't the first 16-bit console of that generation. The PC Engine was the first, and it was popular enough that the Genesis was more recognizable, especially due to the marketing surrounding the Genesis. They went for an edgier approach, consistently poking fun at competitors, more specifically targeting Nintendo relentlessly. Sonic was also becoming much more popular as a mascot for the company, and Nintendo still didn't have an answer for them. The Mega Drive launched in 1988 in Japan, and the Genesis, as it was known in North America, launched in 1989, while launching in 1990 in PAL regions. Nintendo entered 2 years later with the Super Famicom in Japan and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System worldwide. Once these two consoles existed in the market simultaneously, they competed tooth and nail to outpace one another. Now, Sega's head start did have an impact on its perception, but it also received a lot of support when compared to the Master System, even if Nintendo still had many of the exclusive titles that made it stand out, such as Chrono Trigger, Donkey Kong Country, Final Fantasy VI, among others. Now, Sega supported the Genesis extensively, creating many attachments for it in order to push the current hardware even further. Things such as the 32X would let you play 32-bit games on a 16-bit console, which gave gamers the ability to test out this 32-bit content on a tighter budget, as well as even have a CD add-on, the Sega CD, in order to give a cartridge-based system the ability to play content such as music and even games off of CDs. The Genesis was a huge step forward from the Master System, but some of these added implementations really hurt the perception that the public had on Sega and their hardware. The 32X was an expensive add-on with a lot of excitement behind it that ended up falling flat, as it was hardly supported in favor of supporting their next generation system instead, which was a true 32-bit console. This was very upsetting, as it was recognized as an interesting idea, but one that many bought into with very little payoff after the fact. Hardly any games, and especially serious system sellers for this, became available. Then towards the end of the 4th generation, Sega had lost enough momentum for the next generation to become problematic. Either way, Nintendo still sold more SNES units than Sega did with the Genesis, but this generation is remembered as one of the most competitive of all time. The 5th generation console race is when Sega experienced one of the hardest falls from grace that we've seen in this space with the introduction of the Sega Saturn. The system had significant problems that would keep it from soaring as high as it should have. It was a beautiful piece of hardware that worked off of CDs instead of cartridges natively, with a massive upgrade in storage space when compared to the predecessor's cartridges, at the cost of loading times. Also, 3D was officially the format to be explored in games, but this console was notoriously difficult to develop for, and to even port games to, due to it having about 8 separate processing units for graphics and audio. This was not a good idea in practice, since it greatly affected what games made it into the Saturn. Additionally, Sega had very poor communication with retailers in the United States, which caused many of them to drop Sega altogether and not support the Saturn. The system launched in 1995 in North America, and it was $399, which was very expensive at the time, even if it was also a CD player. However, competition was the biggest reason why the Saturn had no chance of succeeding. Just as before, Nintendo still wasn't ready to launch their system, but a brand new competitor entered the ring, Sony with the PlayStation and their incredibly iconic $299 quote, which received so much praise. The PlayStation was powerful and was a full-fledged CD player, which was a big deal. Not to mention that it was much easier to develop games for this system when compared to the Saturn. Even when Nintendo eventually launched their 64 console, it was not very friendly to develop for, and the cartridge storage size limitations were a pretty big deal that affected what games could even make it there to begin with. The vast majority of incredible 5th gen titles made it onto the PlayStation, while Nintendo mostly had very good first-party titles, but they lost a ton of third-party support because of these decisions. And that pretty much left Sega out to dry, as sales slowed astronomically for their console, and support, while still there, was trickling in too slowly. Sega's reputation had already plateaued. The Saturn failed very soon after, but Sega had plans to pioneer the 6th generation just a few short years later. The Sega Dreamcast launched in 1998 in Japan, but in September 9th of 1999 in North America, one entire year before anyone else had an answer to them. This was Sega's most interesting system. It was tiny, yet featured impressive hardware that pushed the limits of what home console gaming could look like. By this point, Sega marketed this console as a 128-bit system. However, everyone else would stop measuring their console's prowess in bits shortly after. It featured a very interesting controller, which seemed unwieldy at first, but it was relatively easy to become acquainted with. Of course, the visual memory unit was a standout feature for this console, as it gave you a second screen to access additional information within certain games. The Dreamcast also had some interesting copy protection in place to prevent gamers from running burnt discs on it, which was circumvented very quickly. and Sega opted for using a proprietary disc system that was very similar to CDs, but it didn't really offer much more than your typical CD. It was about 1 GB in size at the highest capacity, which would quickly become outpaced by other systems. However, the Dreamcast had a built-in dial-up connector to allow the system to natively connect to the internet and to even play games online, which was going to become a big deal some years later. The Dreamcast was quite powerful when compared to anything else on the market, and it was a very iconic console within Sega's lineup. It actually sold quite well around the beginning of its time in the market, but interest in their system quickly fizzled out once it was announced that the PlayStation 2 would have a built-in DVD player, which would offer so much more versatility when it comes to games and entertainment. Microsoft was also getting ready to enter the gaming space in 2001, and Nintendo launched their GameCube system towards the end of that same year. There was too much going on, and Sega simply could not compete with what was merely upcoming. The PlayStation 2 was also going to have the ability to work with hard drives and would support Ethernet instead of just dial-up, while the Xbox would have a much more robust online gaming infrastructure with a built-in hard drive included and the ability to play DVDs with a separate accessory. The GameCube was a cool system, but Nintendo still had some recovering to do from the N64's reception, and the GameCube was not that popular back then. There was nothing that Sega could possibly do, as the Dreamcast was pretty much forgotten once the PlayStation 2, and by extension every other system, was announced and eventually released. The industry was heading in a direction that Sega simply did not account for, and their hardware just was not equipped to tackle. Sega discontinued the Dreamcast about 2.5 years after its initial launch and before the rest of the competition, barring only the PS2 could respond to. This is also when Sega made the decision to drop out of the console race entirely, and they would no longer produce consoles moving forward. This is when Sega, as a hardware business, died. Now, Sega's path forward as a games publisher would prove to be a difficult one. In the early 2000s, Sega started putting their games on other systems, with Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2, which are known for being some of the best Sonic games out there, particularly when it comes to this era of gaming. And even though these did arrive onto the Dreamcast first, Sega released these games on the GameCube, notably known as Sonic Adventure DX and Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. Other Sonic games such as Sonic Heroes, Shadow the Hedgehog, and Sonic Unleashed made it onto every other console platform, which includes the GameCube itself, the Xbox, and the PlayStation 2. Most of these were considered to be great games, and they performed pretty decently on these systems. Then Sega even made games exclusively for Nintendo systems, such as Sonic Advance 1, 2, 3, and Battle, which made it onto the Game Boy Advance. This was Sega's push for keeping themselves afloat, which was a great decision, but their biggest struggles would be unraveled with the introduction of the 7th generation of consoles. Sega prioritized releasing their games quickly, which brought them a lot of issues in the long run. Most notably, Sonic the Hedgehog, or Sonic 06 as it is known as, is a game with so many controversies tied behind it that it has become universally panned and is known as one of the worst, if not the worst Sonic game ever released. This game is jankiness personified, with incredibly awkward cuts, many bugs, inconsistent performance, very long loading times, odd pacing, and incredibly strange story elements. It launched on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 respectively, but this game was an absolute disaster. However, even though they had colossal failures such as Sonic 06, they had other successes that helped to turn things around later on. Sega isn't just about Sonic, it is about the Yakuza games, and with Persona 4 Golden making an entrance on the PlayStation Vita in the early 2010s, Sega had something huge at their disposal. This is due to their purchase of Atlus, which did occur in the early 2010s, so around the release of Persona 4 Golden, making them one of the biggest developers that Sega would publish games for. Sega did continue releasing Sonic games, of course, with many smaller titles making it onto the DS and the PSP, but the Wii ended up getting a lot of support from Sonic specifically. After a long-standing rivalry between Nintendo and Sega, and by extension Mario and Sonic, they decided to combine their forces to create a whole new series of games. This was the Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games series, which was so much fun. This became its own franchise, and it was genuinely really cool getting to see characters from these two franchises work together or even compete on the same screen. Around this time, Sega displayed an openness to working with everyone, and many interesting projects came from these collaborations, but their reputation was not the greatest through the late 2000s and even well into the 2010s, with some projects doing pretty well but others doing more poorly. They were engaging in an uphill battle, but eventually, they found their footing in the industry. As of 2025, Sega has a lot going for it, and most people view them in a positive light. Ever since their initial struggles as a publisher, Sega has pretty much restored the reputation of the Sonic franchise, with their last critically panned game, Sonic Forces, becoming the wake-up call that they needed. Most Sonic games that have been released since then were pretty good, including Sonic Generations games, Sonic Frontiers, Sonic Racing Crossworld, and such. But with Shin Megami Tensei now being a Sega Atlas franchise, Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance did quite a lot for them, but simply did not have as big of an impact as Persona 5 and the spin-offs and complete editions such as Royal that came later on. Persona 3 Reload, Metaphor ReFantazio, Yakuza, among others, have been generally successful, which is to say that Sega has taken greater care to release games when they are ready instead of just launching as many of them as possible. While Sega is not one of the top publishers, especially when compared to the plethora of competition that they have in that regard, they are still doing quite well for themselves. Sega does not seem to be interested in returning to the hardware business, and who can blame them really? This would be the most challenging time for them to return to making hardware, as RAM prices and pretty much all kinds of digital storage continue going up in price, and console sales are at an all-time low. Now this is due to US tariffs, just general inflation creeping in, and of course, the very heavy push towards AI that a lot of companies are pursuing. If they weren't interested in getting back before, now is definitely not a good time. Especially not while they're doing pretty well as publishers. They did release some hardware in the form of a Genesis Mini, but generally speaking, these are just nostalgia products rather than actual hardware meant to compete with current-gen consoles. It's safe to say that 24 years later, Sega more than likely doesn't regret leaving the console hardware business, and as long as they continue publishing great games, then their momentum will continue to grow. So from being in 4 entire console generations of gaming and being utterly defeated by the giants of the industry, to becoming a large gaming publisher after years of struggle in the space, Sega was able to survive as a company. But even more impressive, they were reborn as a pretty successful publisher that plays nice with everyone. Sega's story is certainly an interesting one, and as of today, they've really left a lasting impact. Many people remember their systems fondly, and I myself own a Master System, a Genesis, and 2 Dreamcast, with the expectation that I will buy a Saturn at some point and an SG-1000. But of course, Sega is remembered and recognized as a huge games publisher with a long history of blunders, but just as long of a history releasing fantastic and memorable experiences on so many platforms, including their own. Sega has a very rich history in the gaming space, and one that is worth studying for years to come. I've already made many documentaries on a lot of their hardware, but I haven't touched on 2 very important parts of their history that are severely underrated. At some point, I will make mini documentaries on the Sega Game Gear and on the SG-1000. So if you look forward to watching those videos when they come out, please make sure to subscribe, as I would hate for you to miss them. Now thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and consider pressing the hype button on this video to boost it in the algorithm, and sharing it also helps out a ton. Until next time.